This story is called The Driftwood Man. Tom Everly had lived by the sea all his life, in a rambling old house on the edge of Brindle Cove. The place was falling apart, but it was his, and he'd never known another. Life in Brindle Cove had always suited him, a retired fisherman in his 40s with no family left to keep him tied to anything more than his solitary routines. He'd long ago settled into a quiet existence, lulled by the steady hum of the waves and the salt-tanged breeze off the ocean. But there was one thing that always unnerved him, something even the sea couldn't soothe away: the Driftwood Man. The locals all knew the legend. They said he was a cursed fisherman, cast out for some unnamed crime, who'd taken his last breath on the rocks below the cliffs, his body swallowed by the sea. After that, he'd come back, bit by bit, from whatever washed ashore. People would find strange driftwood figures along the beach, rough, twisted pieces resembling limbs, torsos, even faces, put together in ways that defied explanation. Once, a child had been found screaming by the water, clutching what looked like a weathered, salt-crusted hand in hers. The hand turned out to be driftwood, but the look of it was so uncannily human that her mother had to pry it from her grip. Over the years, Tom had come across a few of the Driftwood Man pieces himself. He'd kick them into the surf, or toss them back into the water, though he could never shake the feeling that something about them felt too alive, too watchful. He never kept them, and he'd heard whispers that if he did, bad things would follow. Then, on an otherwise unremarkable November morning, Tom found something on the shore that made him rethink everything he thought he knew about the legend. It was foggy as hell that morning, the mist so thick he could barely see his own boots. He was heading down to the beach to clear the crab traps when he nearly tripped over something in the sand. It was a piece of driftwood, long, about the length of a human leg. His stomach twisted as he bent down to look closer. It was covered in knotted seaweed and barnacles, but it looked almost jointed, like the knobby shape of a knee and ankle. The wood even had a strange texture that reminded him of skin. Tom hesitated, a cold prickle creeping up his spine. He'd found limbs before, but this one was different, more lifelike than anything he'd ever seen. Before he could think better of it, he reached down and grabbed it, intending to throw it back into the sea. That's when he heard it, a faint whisper, a voice so soft he couldn't make out the words, but it sounded close, as if someone were standing right behind him. He whipped around, heart pounding, but the beach was empty. The fog hung thick and silent, swallowing everything in sight. He dropped the driftwood and backed away, his skin crawling. The fog seemed to press in tighter around him, muting the sound of the waves, and the air grew colder, a chill that seeped into his bones. He turned and walked away, faster than he'd ever admit, and didn't look back. That night, Tom dreamt of the sea. He was floating, weightless, suspended in the water, while something below him pulsed like a heartbeat. He tried to swim to the surface, but something heavy wrapped around his ankles, pulling him down. The water grew darker, colder, pressing into his lungs until he couldn't breathe. He looked down and saw the driftwood leg clamped around his ankle, holding him tight, and there, just below him, a face stared back at him, its eyes pale and empty, mouth open in a silent scream. He woke up drenched in sweat, gasping, the echo of that heartbeat still thudding in his ears. The next day, Tom tried to shake it off as nothing more than a nightmare, but he couldn't ignore the prickling sense that something was watching him. He kept glancing over his shoulder, feeling that whisper of movement, the flicker of a shadow just outside his vision. He told himself it was just nerves, that he'd let the old stories get to him, but it wasn't long before he noticed something that made his blood run cold. One night, while taking out the trash, he spotted a figure by the cliffs. It was too dark to make out any details, but the figure was tall, gangly, with limbs that looked stretched, somehow wrong. It was leaning forward, as if peering into his house. He blinked, and it was gone, swallowed up by the shadows. The following morning, he found driftwood pieces scattered in his yard, a twisted arm here, a crude torso there, a long, gnarled piece that looked disturbingly like a head. He froze, the image of the thing he'd seen last night searing back into his mind. He knew he hadn't left those pieces there. He didn't touch them. He just backed into the house, locking the doors behind him. He shut every window, drew the curtains, and spent the day pacing, glancing nervously outside. By dusk, the fog had rolled in again, thick and unyielding, pressing against the windows like a living thing. And then the knocking started. It was soft at first, almost like a tap, tap, tap against the front door. He ignored it, chucking it up to branches, or maybe even a stray animal. But then it came again, louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. "Who's there?" he called, trying to keep his voice steady. The silence that followed was thick, like the fog pressing against his walls. And then, just when he thought it had stopped, he heard a slow, scraping sound at the back door, like something clawing its way inside. He didn't go to look. He didn't want to know what he might see. That night, the dream returned. This time he was sinking faster, the water around him colder, the face below him closer. He could make out the features now, gouged out eyes, lips twisted in a frozen scream, and that heartbeat, slow and steady, echoing through the depths, louder than his own. When he awoke, the house was silent, but he could feel something there with him, something heavy and watchful, lurking just out of sight. He tried to tell himself it was just the driftwood, just old superstition getting the better of him, but a part of him knew better. The driftwood man was real, and now, somehow, he'd caught Tom's scent. He avoided the beach after that, but it didn't help. Each morning he'd find new pieces of driftwood closer to his house, an arm stretched across the porch, a head lying in the driveway, its hollow eye sockets watching him. One night, he heard footsteps shuffling outside his bedroom window. He sat up, heart racing, and stared at the thin shaft of moonlight seeping through the curtains. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment the silence was so deep he thought he might have imagined it. Then the windows rattled, just once, like something was testing the latch. Tom's breath caught. He crept to the window and peeked through the curtain. For a split second he saw it, the figure standing inches away, its body a twisted mass of driftwood and seaweed, its face a warped parody of a human skull. Its mouth moved, but no sound came out. He stumbled back, clutching his chest as his heart thundered. When he dared to look again, the figure was gone, leaving only the faint imprint of driftwood fingers on the glass. The next morning he made his decision. He had to get rid of it, whatever it was. He gathered every piece he could find, stuffing them into a burlap sack, his hands shaking as he fought back the feeling of being watched. As he stood on the shore, ready to throw the sack into the ocean, he heard that whisper again, closer this time. He turned, and there it was, standing just at the edge of the water, watching him with hollow eyes. "You can't leave it," it seemed to say, though its mouth didn't move. Before he could stop himself, he let go of the sack. The driftwood pieces tumbled out, scattering across the sand like bones. He tried to back away, but his feet wouldn't move. The driftwood man reached out, his fingers brushing Tom's arm, cold and rough as the sea-soaked wood. A heartbeat echoed in his ears, slower, deeper, pulling him down. As the fog closed in, swallowing them both, Tom felt himself sinking, his own skin roughening, his bones becoming brittle, hollow. The last thing he heard was the ocean whispering his name, welcoming him home. The next day, a passerby found pieces of driftwood scattered on the shore, forming a rough, twisted shape, legs, arms, a head staring out to the sea. Locals say it was the driftwood man, waiting for his next visitor, watching with hollow eyes that never seemed to blink. And some say, if you listen closely, you can hear Tom's heartbeat, slow and steady, buried deep beneath the sand.